Intramuros was the biggest European city in Asia. It defines our culture. The problem is most of our officials do not appreciate it.
It's important because it's part of our history, part of our heritage, and one of the few physical evidences remaining of the Spanish period of Philippine history.
There are many good stories about Filipinos, people who headed the construction of the walls. The carvers were Filipinos also. It was a very exciting time. That's what I remember most, having a restoration force as big as Intramuros was at the time. Well, didn't exist anywhere in the country. When we came into Intramuros to work, what are we restoring? We do not know. How did it look, except for the ruined walls? That's why we have to dig pictures and pictures and pictures just to be able to provide a background.
And in the early days, it was really a dead town. Even when Casa Manila was finished, we would make whatever pakulo just to bring in people.
The greatest satisfaction I had was the presence of a good team because basically the three of us were the ones who set the initial directions of the Intramuros administration.
Since last year, I'm really amazed at how Intramuros has grown and has attracted so many people considering the problems we had in the beginning. They have thousands of people coming here, and all of them are paying the entrance fees, restaurants, all those cales. Can you imagine? It's alive.
You have many people saying that Intramuros should not be preserved because it is a colonial memory and that should be erased. I don't think so. So it's about time that our people should see Intramuros is not just a symbol of colonialization, but a symbol of our spirit to rise above that.
Intramuros for me is a place that tells you the story of Manila, the city that I was born in, the city that I worked in, and the city that I live in and will probably live in for the next years. My life with Intramuros began in 1999 when I started volunteering for a museum, Bahay Chinoy. And it was from there that I started doing cultural work, and eventually which led to us establishing our tour outfit in 2005. Intramuros is a place of a lot of personal memories for me because I've been coming here since I was a little boy. I remember my first trip here was in the 1980s when we had a school trip at San Agustin Museum. And I distinctly remember getting freaked out because I went to a crypt with lots of dead people, and which nobody really explained what they were. So that fascination with Manila's history, with my personal family's history, began here in Intramuros. I think what we do here in Intramuros introduces people to our city. And by introducing Intramuros to our visitors, we tell them the story and we make them understand the city, my city, Manila, what it was, how it is today, and what it will be in the future. My hopes for Intramuros is to be a place that is anchored in its past, but at the same time, it's a place that can have new ideas for the future. No? A place that will inspire people, a place that will create good memories, and a place that will make you feel good about being a Manileño. I'm Ivan Mandy. I'm a cultural guide from Old Manila Walks, and we have been doing historical walks around the old city since 2005. I see myself as a cultural worker and a storyteller, and I tell basically the story of our city. And the story of Manila begins here in Intramuros.
Intramuros for me is a sense of curiosity and wonder. It's heritage and history, and it's a living experience. It's a place where you can see history come to life and where we believe there's a strong future for sustainable tourism. So bamboo is arguably one of the most sustainable building materials on the planet. We're using local Philippine bamboo that is then handcrafted into our products so that we can create jobs, but then also share a bit of Filipino design and flair with our international guests. We've been manufacturing bamboo bicycles. It is as part of a sustainable livelihood program. And here in Intramuros, we've been doing guided bamboo bike tours for now it's been about 5 years. And they get to ride the bamboo bikes around these historic walls. You can explore the nooks and crannies, the different chambers and gates and parks and buildings and museums and churches and everything. The different streets here all have something exploration worthy. Bambike helps you discover Intramuros like nothing else. So my name is Brian Benitez McClelland. I'm the founder of Bambike, and we're operating Bambike Eco Tours here in Intramuros. Bambike gets to help the guests experience Intramuros from a different perspective, sharing Philippine culture, our history, and the architecture and the stories of what really were the foundational years of Philippines here in Intramuros.
Every great and important city has an old town. Intramuros to me is Manila's old town. I have always been awed by Intramuros. It seems like when I'm coming here, there is an excitement that you feel that what happened in this place. There is something so sacred, so noble, so precious about Intramuros. I named it after my grandmother, Barbara, to just give it a Spanish flavor. And for some years, after a few years, we decided to really gear towards heritage so that people will see and know what is heritage, what is sinauna, yung kinaugalian natin, yung traditions natin, which will be seen in our cuisine and in our performances, in the dance that we present here in Barbara's. I would attribute it to my mom, to my mother, who taught me the value of work, the value of excellence, the value of feeding people in style and giving them satisfaction. I would want to happen, that Intramuros will be remembered by every person who comes to this place because of its uniqueness, its sacredness, its history, its everything. There's so much here. I'm Barbara Gordon de los Reyes of Barbara's Heritage Restaurant. I have been in Intramuros for the past 30 years, which has been a great part of my work, my joys. It's like an adventure.
I'm Martin Tino Jr. My lolo became chairman of the COMELEC, and he was the one who transferred the COMELEC to Intramuros. I was in grade school. He would go home at 6 o'clock every afternoon. They pick us up at 4 o'clock, so I have to wait for him in his office. So I would go around Intramuros in the early 50s. It was all ruins. I've always been interested in old houses. I began traveling throughout the whole country. Intramuros was the biggest European city in Asia. This is our history. It defines our culture. The problem is most of our officials do not appreciate it. IA was founded. And Jimmy Laya, I didn't know Jimmy Laya. He got me as a consultant. Then we started having exhibits. The first ever on relieves, on santos, on ivory. We have all these horrible looking modern buildings. I wish they could tear it down and rebuild it properly. And in the early days, it was really a dead town. Even when Casa Manila was finished, we would make whatever pakulo just to bring in people. In the afternoon, Intramuros was empty. Empty. There was hardly any people. Since last year, I'm really amazed at how Intramuros has grown and has attracted so many people, considering the problems we had in the beginning. They have thousands of people coming here, and all of them are paying entrance fees, restaurants, everything, all those chalets. So can you imagine? It's alive. You can see the whole thing is alive.
As I always say before, whenever we say Manila, Manila was of course Intramuros, and during the Spanish period, and it was their prime city, and so everything that was about Philippine history and culture during the Spanish and of course the American period began and eventually developed in the Walled City. And in the course of time, this would become also a prime urban tourism area, especially with the restoration and the heritage conservation that has been going on in the city. I think the biggest challenge for Intramuros is for it to be incorporated into that modernization without affecting the historical heritage of the walled city. I mean, accommodations can be done for the modernization that is happening. Internet, telephones, modern facilities for tourists, but it doesn't have to come at the sacrifice of what existed there before. So I think that's one of the biggest challenge until today, for developing Intramuros. I'm Dr. Jose Victor Torres. I'm a associate professor here at the History Department of the De La Salle University. I teach Rizal and Philippine history here in the history department. Well, I think it's because it's one of the closest place. If you're a foreign visitor, it's one of the closest place and one of the most visited based on tourism information. It's one of the most visited places in Manila. Because you have to remember, Manila is the capital city. And a capital city has to have its attraction, both old and new. And for so many years, that old attraction, and I don't mean old because it's passé, it's old because it's part of our past. And the realization that there was something that remained behind for the people to know and experience and see with their own eyes is probably something that's an experience, a good experience for visitors, both foreign and local. I'd probably siguro describe Intramuros as rich. It's rich in heritage, it's rich in the Filipino identity, and it's very rich in our history and culture. And I think that would fit the description not only before but today. And as I always said, whenever you walk through the streets of Intramuros, you are walking through Philippine history.
Intramuros is valuable not only for me but for the whole of the Bureau of Treasury because it's a convergence between the distant past and the present. Over the short span that I have served as the treasurer, I have seen how, through the efforts of the Intramuros administration, places like Fort Santiago, the surrounding walls and gardens, the old churches, and the plazas have become vibrant attractions, showcasing the old alongside the new. So indeed, Intramuros is on the rise. I'm Rosalia De Leon. I'm currently the Treasurer of the Philippines and I've been working here in Intramuros since 2013. Well, personally, Intramuros is important again to me because I find solace after hard day's work. But remembering my childhood, our family would always hear masses in the Manila Cathedral, particularly during Easter Sundays. No? And just the same, there are also times when here in the Treasury, when our jobs will be very demanding, but as we see the surroundings of Intramuros, some sort of takes away, all this stress and reminds us of how lucky we are to be in this place, surrounded by the history of the Philippines around us. I hope that this treasure of ours could be preserved for the generations to come. I hope that we would not be detached, so we could reach out to more people and instill in them a deep sense of our history, the richness of our culture, and a deep sense of the very rich heritage that we have inherited from our forefathers.
very exciting time. That's what I remember most. I was on a holiday and I got a frantic call. Where are you anyway? They have been looking for you. And I said, what about? Having a restoration force as big as Intramuros was at the time didn't exist anywhere in the country. When we came into Intramuros to work, what are we restoring? We do not know. How did it look, except for the ruined walls? That's why we have to dig pictures and pictures and pictures just to be able to provide a background and tell people this is important, this part of the walls look like this. Everything was something that came to us by a calling, you'd say, that we have to do it right. Intramuros is a beautiful memory of the past. It is like a microcosm of all things good and bad. There are many good stories about Filipinos, people who headed the construction of the walls, and they were Indios. The carvers were Filipinos also. People should follow the regulations more, and that they should not seek exemption all the time. And this applies to both government, church, and private owners. I'm Esperanza Bunag Gatunton. I was hired, I would say, I was one of the first employed in the Intramuros administration structure, and that was pretty 1979. You have many people saying that Intramuros should not be preserved because it is a colonial memory and that should be erased. I don't think so. It represents failure. It represents achievement. So it's about time that our people should see Intramuros is not just a symbol of colonialization, but a symbol of our spirit to rise above that.
IA's dedication in ensuring that tangible treasures that immortalize our history are now accessible to the public is commendable.
Congratulations to the Intramuros administration. I wasn't expecting that the collection can be so amazing. It was really an awesome experience seeing all of this collection, and it's like 30% only of the collection. I wish to see more. Again, congratulations.
Masasabi ko ito ay malaking isang tagumpay kasi matagal namin nakatabi, nakatago at hindi na i-display talaga sa public yan. Pangalawa, nagpalipat-lipat na ng location yan at ngayon, na-save natin.
Intramuros mahalaga para sa akin bilang Pilipino kasi maraming bagay sa Pilipinas dito nagsimula sa Intramuros. Well, actually, more than reviving the structures, ang gusto ko talaga maintindihan ng tao kung anong kondisyon ng Intramuros sa pagmuno ng Pilipinas. Kasi kung walang pagkilala, walang pagmahal, hindi siya mananatili. Fernando Sialsita ako, Professor Emeritus sa Ateneo de Manila sa Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Ang mensahe ko lang, dapat mas nuanced, mas complex ang ating pag-create sa kasaysayan. Kasi mahirap itong black and white pagtingin sa kasaysayan. Masyado moralistic, basta Kastila masama. Dapat mas three-dimensional pagtingin sa kasaysayan.
Okay, let's start. Welcome everyone, this is Ranchar Cilia, and welcome to the 29th episode of the Intramuros Learning Session. Today we are going to have a discussion on the Conservation Management Plan of Intramuros, but before that, I'd like to read first some house rules before we proceed. Questions are very much welcome in this discussion. So if you are viewing via Zoom, you may raise your questions via the Q&A button below the screen. And if you are viewing via Facebook, you may raise your questions in the comment section. Later we're going to read them out loud. Note that only questions which are relevant to the topic and within the scope shall be entertained. Only those who have successfully registered and viewed on Zoom will be eligible to get a certificate. A feedback form will be emailed to you after the session, and the certificate will be sent within a week. Note that you need to fill out the feedback form in order for you to get your certificate. This webinar is recorded, and most importantly, get yourself comfortable and enjoy. Now, I'd like to call on the Administrator of Intramuros, Attorney Guilherme Arcido, to introduce to us for today our speaker. Attorney?
Good afternoon, everyone. We welcome you again to another episode of the Intramuros Learning Session. For the past 40 years of its existence, the Intramuros, the historic district of Intramuros in the city of Manila, has seen several development plans. But this is the first time that a conservation management plan has been prepared for the historic urban heritage district. So we will be discussing this afternoon with you, and we will be having this conversation regarding what we have prepared as the We will be having as our main speaker this afternoon Attorney Mark Evidente. Attorney Mark Evidente is a lawyer by profession, but he's also an environmental planner. And he is the president and CEO of 2ECO Incorporated. And he has taught and conducted research at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, and is currently working on a book on heritage and culture law. Attorney Mark finished his master's degree in environmental law, policy, and economics at the Yale University and political science degrees at the University of the Philippines and trained in heritage conservation with the Getty Institute. So we welcome you again this afternoon for an engaging discussion regarding the conservation management plan of Intramuros. Attorney Mark.
Thank you, Attorney. Attorney Mark, you may now proceed with the presentation. Attorney Mark, you are on mute.
Sorry. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Administrator Asido, for inviting me over to speak about the Intramuros Conservation Plan. And I'd like to acknowledge the panelists this afternoon who will be sharing their thoughts on the plan. So let me begin by talking about the conservation plan. Let's see. Okay. The conservation management plan of Intramuros, and within the context of this, since the theme of this webinar, this series is Intramuros Learning Sessions. No? I think there are two kinds of learnings that we can all take away from, hopefully, at the end of this session. And then one would be, of course, that we get to have a broader, deeper understanding of Intramuros. And two, also that we would all get an appreciation of the conservation planning process. No? And that's something that I'd like to talk about in depth this afternoon. Okay. So first, what is a conservation management plan? It should be emphasized that a conservation management plan is a unique document unto itself. No, it's not a business plan. It's not an architectural plan. It's not a physical, social, or economic development plan. It's really all about a way to document and process the different kinds of values of a particular place, what makes a place meaningful to people, and then how to keep that meaning in that place and to communicate that meaning through future generations. No? It is also a way of guiding other plans. So if you want to talk about a business plan or architectural plan, no, and you're dealing with a heritage site, you have to start with the conservation management plan first, to identify what's important and to make sure that those things which are important are kept there and are kept there through time. No? And then you can design the other plans around the conservation management plan. Okay. A conservation management plan is also not just about buildings or monuments. It's not just about historical events. No? It's about finding the meaning of a place because of its location, geography, history, culture, religion, science, business, experience of communities, and experiences of people. No? And when we talk of conservation management planning here in this particular context, it again is not just simply about one specific structure or site, but it's also how it relates to streets, open spaces, infrastructure, patterns, forms, and others, and how they communicate that meaning. So, just as a way of setting the core concepts that we will be dealing with in moving forward with this presentation, there are three key terms that we have to come together on. One is heritage. What do you mean by heritage? Is something that is old heritage already by itself? No? A lot of the definitions of heritage, or these keywords that we have here, are ultimately taken from Republic Act 10,066, or the Cultural Heritage Law of the Philippines. No? And so when we talk about heritage, it's something really that is about our culture, that reveals our identity, but yung crucial element in po dyan is that it is preserved in time and passed on to posterity. No? So it is something, again, identity, and then there's that element na it's passed on through time and to future generations. It can be something which is public or private. No? It can be a government building, or it can be even a private house. No? It can be tangible or intangible. You know? It can be a physical object, or it can be an idea or a concept. No? And that can also be called heritage. No? And finally, it can be movable or immovable. No? It can be something that is fixed to the ground and therefore immovable, or it can be movable, like an object that you can easily carry around and bring with you wherever you go. No? So in other words, the concept of heritage, it embraces really a lot of things, no? From ideas to physical objects, from sites to individual objects and things. No? But what's important really is that there's this element about culture, identity that's embodied in that idea or in a thing or object or concept. No? And then there's that element that it communicates something through time and is passed on to posterity. Second, what is significance? No? Significance is really that element or that aspect of this thing that we're calling heritage. No? What is its importance? What is its meaning that is worth transmitting as part of our identity? It can be something historical. No? Maybe something important happened there, or it's related to one of our historical figures. No? It can be cultural. It can be aesthetic. No? It can be a fine painting or a great work of architecture. No? It can be scientific, a discovery of great importance to a people. No? It can, of course, be spiritual. No? It can be a place of worship or a place of importance, no, to a particular practice or religious or spiritual tradition. It can even be technological, no? Place where industry developed or was born, or any of all these things that are important to a community, a people, a nation. Okay. And what is conservation? No? Conservation is all about finding out what that significance is in a piece of heritage, no? And then how do you communicate that significance? So of course, if it's a historical site, then you want to figure out how to put up signs or markers that celebrate or commemorate that bit of history. But if it's a site that deals with let's say architecture or design, for example, then you want to give preeminence and give recognition to that design or appearance that is of significance to and there are different ways of conservation. Conservation, of course, does not mean just leaving it alone. It does not mean leaving it as a ruin. No, it doesn't also mean automatically that we restore or rebuild. No, okay. Ultimately, the strategy of conservation should be linked with what is important about the site. No? So in some cases, a site might need to be reconstructed. In other places, it might need to remain a ruin. In other cases, it might need to find a different way of communicating what is important about that site. Okay. So ultimately, these three concepts, now, heritage, significance, and conservation. No? When we're talking about heritage, we ask the question, what should be saved? Significance is why should it be saved? And conservation is how should it be saved? No? What, why, and how. Now, when we talk about the conservation process, no, in order for different disciplines to come together, in order for different stakeholders, different communities to come together, you know, and to discern and determine what makes a site important, no, the Australia ICOMOS, ICOMOS, by the way, is this international organization, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, which is a partner of UNESCO, United Nations Education, Social and Cultural Organization. Australia ICOMOS came up with this process as a way to find a way to reconcile Australian narratives of what they are as a people. Of course, they have you have the European settlers, and then you also have these Aboriginal communities. And so how do we talk about and try to reconcile these different experiences, these different stories of people? So Australia ICOMOS came up with something that was known as the Borah Charter, and over time it became accepted internationally as a way of determining and undertaking the conservation process. So I've seen this implemented in Europe. I've seen it implemented in Southeast Asia. So it has really acquired this kind of global recognition, what the international standard is for doing conservation. And it goes through these processes, these steps. One, of course, is understanding the place. When we talk about understanding the place, and we of course look at the history, we look at the architecture, the community interests, the different stakeholders, the different sentiments about the different government agencies, local governments. So all that stakeholder consultations, all that stakeholder engagement goes into understanding the place. And so the people facilitating this process, given that understanding, then they try to distill what makes a place significant. And once we have the significance, the facilitators then go back to the stakeholders, say, this is what we got from the process. Does this actually communicate what we understood from what you felt was important about the place? So there's this back and forth with stakeholders, back and forth with parties, everyone who has a significant stake in how a particular site or place is supposed to be conserved. And then from there, we move over to identifying the different factors and issues that might affect significance. For example, are there development plans that relate to that? Are there community interests in the sense that there might be people who live there and more like rather, what are the other infrastructural conditions that affect the site, or what are the other community considerations? Of course, if the community needs particular things in that area, how do we incorporate that into the conservation strategy? Okay, so these factors come into play, but of course that is all built on this foundation of what is significant in the place. Okay, and then having identified all those things, the significance, the factors and issues, then policies are developed. What values do we want to highlight? What values do we want to implement? And how do we pursue these values? What principles do we need to follow if we're going to manage this site in terms of the needs of all stakeholders? And then finally, all of that is documented in a conservation management plan, which is what we're presenting to you all today, and which you of course had the opportunity to present over the last year, in fact, several times with different stakeholders, and then we presented a lot of our key findings with twice at Intramuros to solicit the final recommendations of stakeholders. And so finally, we have the conservation management plan. We've submitted our final draft earlier this year. And then so now it's turned over to the Intramuros administration to implement the plan and then finally monitor and evaluate its implementation. Okay, so having said that, that's the Borah Charter process, and this is a process that that is now being applied in a lot of heritage sites, a lot of conservation projects, because precisely it has been adopted as the international standard for engaging in this process and allowing different perspectives to come together in a particular site in order to determine really what is significant in a place. So, so we do have our two laws. We have two laws that that help provide the framework for this site. One is Presidential Decree 1616, which created the Intramuros administration, and provided the framework that Intramuros should be restored and rebuilt according to this idea of a Spanish period monument as a monument to the Spanish era of the Philippines. No? Okay. But also in 2009, we have the Republic Act 10,066, the Heritage Act, which also helped define these particular concepts about heritage. Crucially, in Republic Act 10,066, particularly in Section 15, it required there that all conservation works undertaken by the cultural agencies should follow the international standards that have been adopted internationally. And so, following that, we track the different international standards, the different international declarations that have a bearing on Intramuros. From Intramuros as a site with a lot of structures, Intramuros as an urban landscape, Intramuros as a place of tourism, Intramuros as a place of that is a living community. We tried to bring all these different standards together, and you can see that how we tracked them over time and how we felt that they would apply to the Intramuros administration and the Intramuros landscape. And then, of course, we also referred to 3 international treaties to which the Philippines is part of because of having signed up to the UNESCO agreement. So one is UNESCO World Heritage Convention, and of course we have a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Intramuros, the San Agustin Church, and then we have the UNESCO Convention on Intangible Heritage and the UNESCO Declaration on Historic Urban Landscapes. So all of this we took into consideration in terms of defining what standards we would apply in this area that we call Intramuros. Okay. So of particular importance is the historic urban landscape approach. And so in understanding the historic urban landscape, we of course have to understand that it is not a static site. It's not just a historical monument, but rather it's a place where people have lives ongoing. It's an actual living community. And so you need to reflect these things, that there is a historical layering of cultural and natural values, attributes, extending beyond simply the historic center, but it radiates out into the broader city, the broader urban context. And it includes not just the monuments, it can also include open spaces, infrastructure, the urban built form, the pattern of streets. So all these different things that shape how people perceive the landscape, that forms part of what the historic urban landscape is. And so it highlights here that it's not limited to the preservation of single buildings. Architecture is merely one element. So it brings together a lot of different disciplines, a lot of different aspects into understanding what makes a site important. And adopting a landscape approach, it helps us give landscape level conservation decisions. So what do we mean by that? So of course, a site like Intramuros, it is a heritage site, and because it is a living community, people within that community are well integrated with what happens in the surrounding areas. Intramuros is not this island unto itself. It relates to Manila, and so decisions that are undertaken in relation to the site involves reaching out to other stakeholders in the city, other stakeholders in the broader community. Okay. And of course, we don't see urban heritage simply as these individual sites that are static, but rather that they are key ways to generate economic development, social cohesion, by bringing up people together into understanding what adds to their identity as a community and as a people. Okay. And again, it should relate to how we plan for broader development and broader conservation needs throughout an urban setting. Okay, so having established that, so this is our policy framework. We're building on what is provided by law, PD 1616 and Republic Act 10,066, but we're also nurtured and guided by this wealth of international standards, no? And most particularly the Borah Charter process, and then the UNESCO Historic Urban Landscape approach, no? Being among the two most recent and the most widely adopted of international standards that are applicable to this site. So now we talk about development conditions. So I was not the only person that worked on this project, no? And so there were probably a dozen people reflecting different disciplines, no? Interviewing people, doing stakeholder consultations, doing archival research, taking pictures even of the place, no? Doing drone and ground level scanning, no? All these different things, no? To help us get a holistic sense of what the site is and how we should understand the site and the needs of the stakeholders involved. Okay, so we tried then to organize our findings into well, first we're going to talk about the historical analysis now, and we divided the historical phases of Intramuros into 7 key periods, and then discussed it according to government, population, religion, and economic activity. So we adopted this rubric as a way of sorting out the different data that we're getting, no? And then analyzing how that data changes through time. No? Okay. So first, of course, we begin with the pre-colonial settlement. No? Manila as Maynila under Raso Liman, and then that it was this large community already. No? It was a village confederation, and then it was located at this hub, strategic location at the mouth of the Pasig River. No? And the location is particularly important, no? Because one is that, of course, it's there in the middle of the bay. No? The location is in the middle of this of Manila Bay. No? But because it is located on the banks of the Pasig River, no? It gives access quickly to the southern Tagalog region. No? So from the river, then you're able to access Laguna Lake. No? Okay, so if we start there, then you start seeing how this is a very rich environment. No? You had salt water on one side, fresh water on the other, mangroves on one side, fertile plains on the other, no? And the mountains with all the resources of timber, wildlife, and all that. We're not too far beyond. No? So then that helps us understand why a settlement was there to begin with. No? And then, of course, that settlement by 1571 or even in the 16th or 14th, no? Centuries, no? It was already a settlement that was well entrenched in the trade network of Asia, right? So this was a settlement that was dealing with China, with a lot of settlements throughout Southeast Asia, no? And so when Spain arrived, no, and saw that opportunity, that not only was it strategically located from a defensive point of view, but it was also strategically located in terms of controlling this economic system, this trade network, then it was really of great value to colonizers to seize this particular piece of land. No? And so we see that that the historical record gives us an idea that this was a fortified Muslim settlement. No? It was an enclave that was protected with a wooden fort, no? And then it had this great strategic location that generated interest in it. No? Okay, so on those 4 pillars, no? So there is an existing government, no? There is a ruling class there. It had a sizable pre-colonial settlement, no? And it was basically Islamic, no? Tracing its origins from migrating Muslim groups. And then there was that economic network that Manila was already well integrated in. So when Spanish colonizers arrived, no? Then we have now the presence of Spain in the Philippines, no? And Spain takes over that trade route. No? So and then Intramuros becomes the center of government, and then the center of religion. Of course, at that time, church and state went together. No? And then so we see how the different religious orders start establishing their mother houses, no, or their monasteries within Intramuros. No. But even throughout the period, there are revolts, there are earthquakes, there are fires and epidemics, there are attacks by pirates. No, there's the British occupation. So, but yet throughout this entire period of almost 200 years, the settlement remained there. No, it in fact became more and more fortified. The wooden palisades turned into stone. The stone fortifications in turn became more reinforced. No, and this is also indicative of how Intramuros is linked to the entire network of Spanish colonies throughout the world, no, where they established similar fortifications. No? Okay. And that building technologies were being adopted and transmitted back and forth throughout the Spanish colonial empire. No? Okay. So Manila now becomes not just a seat of government, but also a seat of military power. No? And then a new population is introduced. No, it's that there are now Spanish settlers entering into the picture, and then a mix. But it's also there's a mix of different trading communities coming in, no? And then the establishment of religion, the religious orders. But the religious orders also established the universities of this period, no? And then again the galleon trade starts up. So we see here Intramuros from that period, you know, and how it relates, so Intramuros to that period. And then after that period, because of all those invasions and epidemics and calamities that we mentioned earlier, people started moving into communities outside the walls. No? And so we see here the growth of Binondo into a trading community, no? And Manila starts becoming even more prosperous because Manila opens up to world trade. No? Okay. So one of the main reasons why the population moved out is because of the British occupation. It showed the vulnerabilities of staying just within Intramuros. No? That since that would be the target of any invasion, so people started moving out into different settlements. No? And so when the population was centered around Intramuros, then it starts moving out and becomes urban sprawl. No? Okay. So here you will see on the map, no, how the different settlements had at this period been spreading out from Intramuros itself. No? So we see it now on the northern bank of the Pasig, how a lot of the communities had settled there. And then here's a picture from the period on how the plaza looked like, and of course Manila Cathedral at the back. And we see here, that you see the walls of Intramuros on the left, right? And then how we now see how much of the trade is actually now happening on the right side of the bank, which is of course the Binondo area of Manila. Okay. Again, the destruction of the Manila Cathedral, I believe this because of the earthquake. So this spurs people moving out of Intramuros, and even the Governor General. No? So at this point, this is when the Governor General moves from Intramuros to Malacanang. No? And so with that movement, then a number of government offices also started moving out and then relocating around Malacanang. But still, Intramuros remains the center of government functions, a hub for religious activity, educational institutions are there. But the community, the community is changing over time, with people moving out, new settlers coming in. So it becomes a much more dynamic community. Okay. So there we have pictures that highlight these are the students, moving through Intramuros, highlighting how it becomes this place, and then we see how the urban sprawl is spreading out even further from the city. Okay. And then here during the American period, from 1905 to 1945, the Intramuros evolves. One is that one of the earliest attempts to preserve Intramuros happens during this period, no? When the Americans declare Intramuros as a relic of the past, no? And that it should be conserved as this site, no, to the Spanish colonial period, no? And even when American urban planner Daniel Burnham comes to the Philippines and then starts creating a master plan for the city, no, he integrates Intramuros in that, no, as this area of, you know, conveying that sense of history for the Philippines, no? Okay, but a lot of government functions have moved out, no. A lot of government offices moved to the Malate area. A lot of institutions moved to the Malate area, no. And then what was the defensive moat of Intramuros became filled in, renamed as a sunken garden, and then starts becoming used as the golf course, no. But in World War II, Intramuros was devastated, no. The area within the walls was practically leveled, with the exception of San Agustin Church, and major sections of the wall, particularly on the southern side and the eastern side, no, were destroyed during the war, no. Okay. So you see here again the movement of the different four pillars, no. Government offices being transferred, the military, while the military maintains a presence in the area, no. And then students and transits live within the walled city, no. Very few of the Manila's original inhabitants remain within the place, no. Intramuros remains the seat of the Manila Archdiocese. Major religious orders still maintain their provincial houses there, and schools remain, no. But already the major orders are starting to move out, no. And then finally the custom house remains in place, no? So we're seeing how the different elements of government, population, religion, and economics evolves through time. So you see here, yeah, how the moat was filled in and then turned into the golf course, no? And there is this public health rationale for this, no? Because of course the moat kept a lot of stagnant water, and so it was a breeding place for mosquitoes and the different diseases that mosquitoes carry, no? So that was the rationale for filling in the moats, no? But unfortunately, because the moats were filled in, now we don't appreciate really how significant or how massive the walls are, you know, because since the level increased, no, and then so in relation to the walls seem much smaller, much shorter than how they really were, no? And then of course we have the religious processions from this period, no? So Intramuros having been destroyed in this post-war period, no? The post-war governments did not really know what to do with Intramuros, no? There were times that they would want to preserve it, no, and then or rebuild it according to records, old documents, no, of the site, no? But there are also people who wanted to tear it all down and just rebuild a new community, no, an entirely modern community, no? So this is back and forth, and then but even through this period, no, every now and then the key elements of Intramuros get declared as important heritage sites, like Fort Santiago, for instance, no? And so and then there's this move to like widen the streets to accommodate more traffic, no, and to turn this place into a more commercial district or a more industrial district, no. But ultimately by 1965, no, by 1965, 66 to the present rather, then this drive to create Intramuros as this site of conserving this idea of the Spanish colonial settlement that Intramuros was, no, starts getting locked into place, no, and then finally is enshrined, so to speak. The idea is being enshrined in law when we have the charter of the Intramuros administration in 1979, and that remains the governing principles for Intramuros to this day, no? I want to just go back to some of the earlier slides, no? Okay, so here we documented how in our research we documented the walls that are still largely intact from the 19th century. No? So we see that the map. No, the map is you'll see the arrow of the compass points on the upper left corner. No, so north there, and then so the south western wall south and western walls remain largely intact. It's the southeastern wall that had been destroyed, no, as the Americans invaded and took over Intramuros from the Japanese during World War II. Okay. So in that post-war period, no, a lot of the government offices move out, and then some start trickling in. Population changes. Now, while the student population is there, no, it changes significantly because what had used to be the different schools of the different religious orders are now become largely secular. No? And so the student population also changes. And then the religious orders move out, although the San Agustin remains, Manila Cathedral remains, and the CBCP remains. No? But there's also this change in population because since a lot of properties were demolished or destroyed during the war, there also enters this influx of informal settlers, no, in this period, and this community remains there to this day. Okay. So today the setup that we're seeing in these four pillars, no. So now we see in government, no, while the seat of government has not been in Intramuros for quite some time now, major government offices are located in Intramuros. No, you have the NCCA, the BIR, Bureau of Immigration, the COMELEC, and of course the Intramuros Administration, Bureau of Treasury, and all that. No, okay. Next, you have a different population, but it's still a lively, dynamic population itself. No, you have the students, you have the informal settlers, you have tourists coming in, you have people who live there, people who work there, all of these different communities coming together in this place. No? Education, Intramuros still remains one of the most important concentrations of schools. And we have these religious edifices, no? San Agustin Church and Monastery, which becomes declared as a World Heritage Site, and the Archdiocese of Manila rebuilds the cathedral in the post-war period and then restores it in 2014. And then economic activity, this is where tourism starts picking up. Tourism was probably a negligible element in the American period, and then now because of the central emphasis that had been given to it in the charter of the Intramuros Administration, and then placing the Intramuros Administration underneath the Department of Tourism, no, then it becomes a key element in the Philippines tourism program. No. Museums are rebuilt, museums are established, there's some investment in hotels, restaurants, and all that, no, to cater to this interest from tourism. But there still are a lot of businesses in the area. No. Intramuros is a site for a lot of the shipping companies, the manning agencies. No, a lot of them operate out of Intramuros and provide a big driver to the economy of the area. So the architects on the team, no, they examined the different structures, no, and then they noted that one, no, Intramuros was part of this global network of Spanish fortifications. No? So, as mentioned, it is the largest collection of defense constructions ever to be built by one organizing authority, at that time. Okay, so you could imagine that, of all the Spanish colonies, from the Philippines to Latin America all the way to Europe, all these different patterns and technologies are being adopted and then changed and exchanged over time, through all these building patterns. Okay. Next, so there is this documentation of the walls, from the 1898 period, what was opened up, in 1945 by the Americans to establish these buildings along the Pasig River, and then what was destroyed during the war, and what was rebuilt at present. No? What has been rebuilt at present. Okay. So what's important also is that Intramuros becomes this template for settlements in the Philippines. No? The template developed in America, no? Then starts being adopted here also in the Philippines, no? Beginning with Intramuros and then spreading out to the rest of the Philippine islands. No? So the idea of having the plaza, the church on one side, the government building on the other side, no? This whole interplay and this whole dynamic of the gridded streets around the plaza, that becomes a template that had been adopted throughout the Spanish Empire. No? Okay. So yeah, it had been described, no, by this writer, no, that you have the grid form, the monumental Catholic cathedrals, stately public buildings, a centrally located Plaza Mayor, smaller squares, open spaces, 5 monastic complexes, and 600 handsome 2-story houses of Spaniards. So a lot of the key elements of what would define the identity of Intramuros had already been outlined and described in this from this book. In, I think this was in the 18th century, I believe. Okay. And then what is also interesting is that from the earliest phase of Intramuros, no, the pattern of the walls, the pattern of the streets had been largely maintained, no, largely intact. No. Could even say like 90-95% of the grid pattern, the key elements, and the walls, no, have been consistent over the last 500 years. No. So that includes the boundary, the territory surrounded by the walls, the fortifications, the grid layout, the width of streets, no, the plaza complex. No. So these elements of this built landscape form part of what Intramuros is. No. Okay. And as mentioned, it formed now the pattern that would then be replicated throughout the country. And it gets codified in the royal ordinances for discoveries. No? So it appears even that while it was, we now have this debate whether Intramuros influenced these ordinances. No, this is the laws of the Indies. No, or did the laws of the Indies influence Intramuros? No? So I think it's it would seem to be that our finding that since Intramuros was established even before the ordinances were issued and released to the Philippines, no? That maybe Intramuros in fact helped codify certain elements that would then find their expression in the laws of the Indies. No? Okay. Here. So then we have the documentation of open spaces and how that changes over time. So you'll see that from 1898, no, you have the road network, no, and then it's just these connectivities to the outer areas get developed in 1945, no, and then some blocks, just a few blocks, no, the crossroads are eliminated, especially in the schools, no. So just to go back, so you can catch that, no. So it's in the top portion of the map, no, that disappears there, and then also there, okay. And then new parks are also established, and some parks are erased over time. Okay. So we also documented the different kinds of architecture that we see today. No? So with red, we see the colonial architecture. Okay. So we have Fort Santiago on one side, and then the San Agustin complex on the other, no? in the middle. No? And then early colonial revival architecture. You know, so this is in that, shall we say, these are now the attempts of starting to reconstruct according to that. And then so you have the late colonial revival, and then postmodern architecture. Okay, so it's worth noting that in 1979, with adopting the Intramuros Administration Charter, it required now that a lot of the structures, it required that that Intramuros be restored in this appearance of this Spanish colonial town of the 1890s. No? So some of those buildings that were reconstructed or built since then, no, adopted that colonial revival style. No? Yun. So we have that here. But you'll still see that a lot of the buildings are actually postmodern. So these buildings were developed in that post-war period. No? So you'll see that some of them are the schools and some of them are office buildings. No? And then you have also some of the modern architecture there. No? Again, also you'll see most of it is in the school district at the top of the map. No? Okay. And then we of course have the informal settlements, and they're grouped here on that upper quadrant of Intramuros. No? Okay. So you'll see that this is a very mixed landscape. No? That we have different kinds of architectural styles. Some are good examples, some are bad examples. No? But we have this mixed landscape of different building technologies, different designs, no? That had been implemented over the last so many years. No? Okay. So we also looked at the regulatory framework. How did the government see Intramuros, and how did they establish a framework for it? So as mentioned, even during the American period, there was already a standard that Intramuros would be preserved as a relic to the past and to adopt the Spanish-Filipino architectural standard. In that post-war period, since Intramuros was destroyed during the war, then there was this vacillating, this swinging between this Spanish-Filipino architectural standard or opening it up to modern needs and modern architecture. No? And so during this period, this is where we see this greater diversity in the different kinds of architectural styles and buildings. No? And then finally, in the reconstruction phase, no, in this 1966 period onward, then we start talking about moving back to this Spanish-Filipino architectural standard, establishing these national monuments for purposes of our national identity, for purposes of tourism, and then creating the Intramuros administration to implement it. Okay. So the Intramuros Administration's Charter places IA in charge of everything governmental happening to Intramuros. No? It involves the restoration of and heritage aspects, no? Developmental and land use and regulation, culture and tourism, even traffic, security, buying and expropriating property, no? And this general regulation for the area. Okay. But there are also other laws that affect Intramuros. No? The National Cultural Heritage Act talks about presumptions over important cultural property. So there are the works of national artists, and there are buildings over 50 years old. So a lot of these modern buildings that were put up during that post-war period are in fact also covered by the National Cultural Heritage Act. So on one hand, we have this legal mandate to preserve the Spanish colonial appearance on one hand, and then we also have another mandate to protect buildings over 50 years old and works of national artists. No? So you have these two laws coming together in Intramuros. No? Then we also have the Tourism Act of 2009, no? and it reinforces the attachment of the Intramuros administration under the Department of Tourism and gives the Intramuros administration the possibility of establishing tourism enterprise zones in that area to help encourage the rebuilding and reconstruction in a particular standard. And also there is the UNESCO Heritage Framework now, with the Declaration of San Agustin and its buffer zone as well as a World Heritage Site. Then that also is entitled to its own legal regulatory system. And then, of course, there's the application of the historic urban landscape approach, which I mentioned at the start of this presentation. So PD 1616 has these implementing rules, which talk about a particular architectural standard. No? Regulations were provided regarding building heights, the use of materials, facades. No? A land use plan was developed, no? That it would be a mixed use area. No? And then that it also enumerated specific structures of high priority that would be conserved in the strictest sense. No? And so these are among the sites that were mentioned. No? The walls and fortifications, Fort Santiago and the Gates, San Agustin, the Manila Cathedral, adjoining blocks, the Ayuntamiento, Intendencia, and so on and so forth. No? So we have, in other words, a number of sites which are supposed to be restored according to the best available knowledge and technology to reflect the knowledge and technology of the particular period, no, the 1890s. No. Then you have this landscape, no, everything else within the area. There's a mandate that it now reflect Filipino and Spanish architecture. No. And then also now we have this another mandate on top of that, because of the National Cultural Heritage Act, that certain buildings, because they had been designed by national artists and meet the test of the 50-year-old heritage protection. No? Then so you have these different legal mandates coming together in trying to protect and define what Intramuros is. No? There were various development plans that were developed, as mentioned by the administrator. No? So this 1991 Urban Development Plan sets out the different zones of the area. No? And then another one in 2016 also defines these different zones. No? There's a heritage and tourism zone. There's an institutional zone. There are the parkways and all that. No? Okay. So moving further in understanding the place, we did community consultations. We talked with a lot of different stakeholders. No? We talked with various experts, now historians, architectural historians, people who have done a lot of research in Intramuros from the academic point of view. No? And what they kept hammering on about is that they want to make sure that it's properly communicated to everyone who visits Intramuros, that what people are seeing is merely a simulacrum, a simulation of what Intramuros was. No? That everything was destroyed during the war, except for sections of the wall and San Agustin. No? And so what we're seeing are not really, centuries old buildings, right? Everything else is not. These are new structures, no? And we have to be honest about that. No? And the emphasis should instead be placed, no, on the role of Intramuros as the center of political, cultural, religious, and educational life in the country during the Spanish colonial period. We talked with tour guides, people who had done a lot of research also on Intramuros. And then one of their main considerations, one of their main concerns is that when people do go on their tours, there's just very little information about what really happened in Intramuros, or that Intramuros, people think that Intramuros is a theme park, that it closes at certain times or things like that. There is this failure to realize that there are actually people who live, work, study, worship within Intramuros. And so that when tourists do enter the place, they do have to be mindful that they are both contributing to and disrupting the community that exists within Intramuros. And that there is always the concern about the informal settlers. Even the government has moved back and forth on whether the informal settlers should be transferred elsewhere or they should be integrated. So what's important to highlight though is that the informal settlers, they do perform essential functions for the community. And that different community members must work together and recognize each other's roles. Whether it's providing bed space for other employees, or other employees might actually live within these informal settlements, or they help support the different economic activities of the area. Like for example, Xeroxing or photocopying services for the students. Even something these or street vendors. Even something this routine or this basic, oftentimes we can be blind to it, and then but rather looking at the needs of different stakeholders, we need to find ways of integrating all of these things together. Next. This is an incident. We talked with a number of schools, representatives of religious orders, and then some number of the businesses that exist within Intramuros. And then so the main sentiment was that people are generally happy that Intramuros is much livelier today, mainly because of tourism bringing interest and economic activity. But they're also very concerned with how it has grown dirtier and more crowded over time. And they would like to see that events should be brought back into Intramuros, or new events should be developed that keep the community engaged in this process. No? We've talked to residents, no? and crucially in the residents, no? Both the formal and informal residents. No? What was interesting in talking with informal settlers, no, is that they help provide a perspective on those years in the post-war period, no, when Intramuros was not much the focus of the state, no? Because we would see that a lot of the history of Intramuros is really all about the state and a lot of state institutions, no, how they've changed over time. And then in that post-war period, when the state didn't know what to do with Intramuros, no, it was the informal settlers that kept the place going, and they helped provide this sense of history of what was going on in Intramuros. No? It was a different kind of Intramuros. It was a different kind of story that they were telling us about their struggles in making these informal settlements work, the different, shall we say, competitions between the different, competition is putting it mildly, no? But that there were different communities that were struggling with one another in trying to make Intramuros work for them in that period. No? And so we talked with other people who were like, a third generation Intramuros resident already from, and the Lolos and the Lolas were there to help give insights to how Intramuros was in the 50s and 60s. Okay. So, and then on top of those in-person focus group discussions, no, we tried to get also this sense of what stakeholders in general feel. No? So we ran a public online survey. No? We had over 1,000 post interactions with 162 respondents. And we felt that the 162 respondents was quite an achievement, considering that the survey would take around more than 30 minutes to fill up. No? And so, but a lot of them gave a lot of insights about what they thought Intramuros should be like, what they felt that Intramuros priority should be, no? And how attached their lives are to Intramuros. No? So you can see here that majority of our respondents visit Intramuros regularly, no? From several times a year to daily, no? And traveling there for leisure, history, culture, tourism, work, religious activities. No? And then they stress that their idea of Intramuros is really the walled city, the historic walled city, where history, tourism, and culture are of overwhelmingly high importance. Religion, society, education are also important. No? Politics and business are there. No? And then so different feedback on what things should be better remembered or better communicated over time. No? Okay. We also asked them for what the development priorities are. No? And so there's really that prioritization of history, culture, and tourism. But there's also this awareness of wanting to integrate the existing residential communities, providing more lifestyle and leisure establishments. No? So we're really seeing that people are appreciating and understanding this area as something that can be really a mixed-use development that integrate a lot of different needs and experiences in one particular place. No? Okay. There was a lot of concern about public spaces, open space parks, no? Public amenities, no? And then next about accessibility in terms of transport, walkability, and all that. No? And then more about marketing, tourism, no? And then reconstruction, and then public safety and public amenities. Okay. Then we also did archaeological considerations. No? That now that any new structure being developed in Intramuros should undertake some archaeological assessment. No? And right now, a lot of the archaeological study reveals that there's a lot of findings, no? But mainly from the colonial era to the modern period. No? And why is this the case? No? Because in the pre-colonial period, no, there seems to be a lack of permanent or durable material from earlier settlements. And of course, this area was still really much a very active river delta, as is much of Manila. No? The bedrock is quite deep. No, there's a lot of silt, and the entire city is built on silt, and that doesn't really provide this great foundation for building things or for storing things. Okay, so finally, just give me a moment. Excuse me. So, yeah. So, having said all that, no, and that one is essentially just that first phase of understanding the place, no. But hopefully, the idea that the depth of the research that we are doing, in terms of documenting all these things, no, and then also talking with the different stakeholders, no, that all of this was taken into consideration in developing this strategy. No? Okay. So finally, taking all of that into consideration, we tried to come up with a statement of significance. The statement of significance is central in any conservation plan because, again, as going back to the definitions, when we talk about heritage, we are focused on significance, no? Because we want to highlight what is important in a place, no? And how we communicate that place to future generations. No? So a statement of significance is a way to summarize that idea, and that would then guide the policies and the measures and the plans that would be taken after the conservation management plan has been completed. No? Okay, so that said, no. So first, the main ideas, no, are that I've summarized them here according to our key points. No, that the most important, of course, is that Intramuros as the center of political, religious, economic, social, and educational life during the Spanish colonial period. Okay, but even with that, as the foundation of what makes Intramuros important, no? And that one is what is highlighted and emphasized in PD 1616. It also should be emphasized that this is an evolving and resilient community, that something was there before Intramuros and something exists there in Intramuros after the Spanish colonial period. No? So that stretch of history, for looking further into the past and from the 20th century onward, no, that story of Intramuros also has to be captured. No? Because if you think of Intramuros as having this settlement for 300 years, no, right now, no, this modern period, no, from 1898 to the present, is already 122 years after the Spanish colonial period, right? So even that, no, just the period of time, that's already 1/3 the amount of time that Spain occupied Intramuros. So there's so much that should be told, should be captured, should be communicated also in the current period. No? The American period, the Japanese occupation, the destruction during World War II, no? So all these things, no, should be captured and communicated also as part of the story of Intramuros. No? Also, we need to tell more about the pre-colonial period. No? We need to do more in finding about the pre-colonial period. And so that stretch of history and prehistory, no? That there is a community that has existed here for hundreds of years, that story must be told as well. No? The next point is that there is a reason why Intramuros developed. As mentioned earlier, there are geographical issues, no? There are natural considerations, there are strategic considerations, and that those things played a big role in the centrality of Intramuros in global trade networks. No? From a trade network that spanned Southeast Asia, East Asia, no? And then connecting it now to Latin America and Europe. Then there is also that role of Intramuros as an expression of this pattern of fortifications, urban planning, and development throughout the Spanish colonial empire, and the technologies they represent. But there's also this social story that from the very start of Intramuros as Intramuros, there is this dynamic of inclusion and exclusion, right? The Spanish and the Indio, and over a period of time, the mestizos and then the non-mestizos, and then so even to this day, this idea that some groups have the ability to dictate who should be inside or outside Intramuros. It seems to echo that process of inclusion and exclusion. So there is also that dynamic, and there's also that story that's there. What also needs to be understood that is this role in the American colonial project of Manila and the Intramuros of memory. What do we mean by the Intramuros of memory? The idea that we have of Intramuros is not even the Intramuros of the Spanish colonial period. Why? Because this whole process of documenting how Intramuros looks like are by and large the efforts during the American colonial period to take pictures and document all these structures and all these places. So this is actually how things look like from the 1890s onwards, rather than a genuine historical record of how they looked like in the 16th or 17th or 18th, 19th centuries. Okay. And then there's also that aspect that Intramuros, again, perhaps channeling the story of the Filipino, that it has also survived and remained resilient in the face of natural and human disasters. Earthquakes, fire, invasion, and yet people come back, rebuild, and add something new to the story of what Intramuros is. And then, of course, it is also the setting for the UNESCO World Heritage Church of San Agustin. So we have all these different elements coming together, and that so from political, economic, social, and how these different things changed over time, that to us, and that is our way of summing up all the different inputs that we've received from our archival research, our interviews with historians, our interviews with all the different stakeholders in Intramuros, and we summed it up in that way. So, talking now about policies, what are the challenges that we would have if we were to implement and design policies for this area? One major one is that we do have to work within the mandate of a law, right? So even though we have all these different ideas, all these different standards that have shown different perspectives from the different parts of the world on how urban landscape should be developed, conserved, or integrated, but ultimately we are constrained by what PD 1616 says, that there is a mandate that Intramuros should be built or rebuilt or reconstructed according to this idea of the Spanish colonial town. There is also the resident community. There are a lot of sentiments that the resident community has. They, of course, have felt very, they have resisted this idea that they should be forcibly resettled, and that they long to be recognized as a proper stakeholder in Intramuros. And that's something that has only been taking place really in recent years. There's also the issue about authenticity. A very crucial aspect of conservation is understanding what is authentic and then seeing how to represent and communicate that for future generations. So the challenge is that how can authenticity be reflected if so much is not known about how this place really was like in the 19th century? Why do we say that we don't know much of how it was like? Remember that this was a working community, a living community, and oftentimes only the major political or religious structures really get documented. You will see a lot of pictures of the Plaza, Manila Cathedral, San Agustin Church, or the Governor General's Palace. No? A lot of these state or church structures, no, were well documented. That's why we can reconstruct them to some level of accuracy. No? But a lot of everything else within Intramuros, no, there's very little to go on. No? And perhaps that's why archaeology also takes an additional significance to figure out what was there in all these different sites before the current period. No? Next. So those were the three main issues that we tried to deal with. So how do we move forward? So we tried to reconcile a lot of these issues, reconcile a lot of these different considerations, and then the inputs from the different stakeholders. And we wanted to summarize our recommendations in this way. So first, we have recommendations on preservation of streets and open spaces. We felt this was important, no? Because this was one of the few things that really was well documented and has remained remarkably consistent and authentic over the last 500 years. No? The streets, open spaces, the walls. No? Land use. No? Intramuros has historically been a mixed-use settlement. No? Like with any old city, that you have businesses and residences on top, no? And then you have different street level activities going on. You have churches beside houses, offices beside churches. Now it's really mixed use. It evolves naturally over time. No? And so we continue to recommend that because ultimately, even from an urban planning perspective, it's really when you have this mixed use zoning that we have better, more integrated communities. No? So another aspect is this lot parcelation. It also seems that a lot of the lots, no, a lot of the different parcels, no, how they were divided, no, are still largely consistent with how they were allocated and divided over the previous centuries. No. We wanted also to highlight that Intramuros is not just a site unto itself. Its significance relates to a lot of other sites in Manila Bay and in the area of Manila and of course farther afield into Asia and to Latin America and Europe. No? So there's a connection to the bodies of water. There are the fortifications also in Cavite, and those two things, Manila and Cavite, really interact. No? And so Corregidor also is part of that. That combination of fortifications really help in securing the bay. No? There are also a lot of sites along Rojas Boulevard, which are fortifications actually. No? And then that interpretation that this significance of Intramuros should ultimately be presented to the general public and regularly communicated and needs an interpretation plan to communicate that to the public. Okay. So we emphasize, of course, the need for archaeology, that archaeological studies should be conducted in any development. Just because that we don't know a lot of what happened in the different places within Intramuros. So archaeology can be a good way of finding out those stories. No? For individual buildings, no, it's important that that the documentation be gathered, and that documentation, that research should form the basis of conservation plans in the future. No? And that should also include the post-war and modern heritage. So every site which is of heritage significance should really be better documented, researched, and that data conserved and communicated through time. We wanted and we recommended that there should also be a way of communicating this knowledge forward. No? So there would be an Intramuros Study Center that would then work with a lot of the universities within Intramuros and in the broader community, you know, in terms of documenting the history, the building technologies, architectural traditions, and patterns of the place, no, and all of that coming together and having this repository within Intramuros, no? Okay, and that something that we often skip in planning is that there should always be a maintenance and disaster risk management plan. We felt that this was something that should be further studied. Now, we gave initial recommendations, but it's something that should be further studied and be the subject of a separate planning effort. We noted that setting is important. The Intramuros, even today, it acquires a particular appearance, a particular, shall we say, grandeur, because it is set where it is. That you have these roads lining its perimeter, and then you have this golf course that provides this setting, that helps provide this buffer zone, this space between Intramuros and the surrounding areas. Okay, so that setting should be maintained, should be conserved, so that the significance of the walls and the place can be properly framed. But we do have a caveat that subject to further study, that certain portions, the moat should also be reconstructed, so that the proper perspective regarding the walls can be provided. Because right now we only see like 3 or 4 meters of the wall, when in fact it should be much deeper, much higher than that. So for us to understand this place, it might be necessary to do interventions like that. There's also a need for greater research on the intangibles, what more about the individual lives of the community, how it changed over time. That needs to be better communicated and captured. And also that even as the law requires that Intramuros appear a certain way, there's still a way to capture all the different history and experiences and stories of Intramuros. And if we can capture that and communicate that within the proper structures. So we'd also need to recognize that Intramuros evolves. It is not frozen in 1890. And it is important that that evolving significance is captured and communicated. Okay. Also, that Intramuros is not an island. It is connected to how the entire city works. And so when it comes to planning documents, land use plans, development plans, the City of Manila, the MMDA, the other LGUs of Metro Manila, and Intramuros administration should really work together on integrating all these different needs into the conservation management plan. And that local and national government should work together because in Intramuros, that working together has to be under and implemented with the Intramuros administration, because Intramuros administration has that particular mandate for this specific area. Okay. Community development initiatives should be well integrated in a way that the community understands the heritage impact of development initiatives, and that finally they should also be involved in the conservation process, that they should also be active participants in making sure that the message, the stories of Intramuros are communicated to the next generation. Okay, and I think with that, I'm at the end of my presentation. Thank you all, everyone, for listening to our conservation management plan, and I'd be glad to hear the feedbacks and suggestions of our panelists, and of course, I'd be glad to answer questions from our audience. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Attorney Evidente. Now, we shall now proceed with the review from our reactors. So for today, we will have 7 reactors. So we have the pleasure of having today the Executive Director of the National Archives of the Philippines, Victorino Manalo, as well as the Chairman of the National Commission, the Chairman of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, Rene Escalante. And we have as a stakeholder Mr. and Mrs. Oscar Medalla. And we're also going to hear from Tina Paterno, who is at present the president of the International Council on Monuments and Sites. And we also have Reynaldo Lita, who is a restoration architect. So he is presently the chief of the Historic Preservation Division of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines. And lastly, we're going to have Edison Molanida, who is currently the coordinator for LGUs of the National Commission for Culture and the Arts. Now, I'd like to call on Director Victorino Mapa Manalo. Sir, would you like to have any comment on the presentation?
To possible development plans in the area of tourism, that the idea that the best places to visit are the best places to live in, no? So in other words, what kind of inputs, or is this the place for it, no? What kind of inputs would you be able to put in that has to do with planning Intramuros to be a wonderful place to live, no? For its, especially for for our kinds of residents, no? Very often kasi we are looking for tourism values, we're looking for heritage values, and the livability of the place may not be as emphasized, no? But I've always felt strongly about that axiom that the best places to visit, or the best places for tourism, are actually the best places to live. And in fact, it may be the better part of valor to concentrate on the living aspect. And then the second thing that I was going to say is that I was wondering how you did talk about having a more inclusive narratives, of being able to include all kinds of storylines and perspectives in the statement of significance of Intramuros. I wonder if there's space in that in those narratives for a narrative of sadness, no? A narrative of tragedy, because in many ways Intramuros is a story, aside from being a vibrant, wonderful story of so many things, no, so many things about our country. It is also it also projects, or it can also embody a story of sadness, a story of abandonment. The idea that even in the Spanish colonial period, by the 19th century, by the end of the 19th century, Intramuros was already being abandoned by the Spanish elite, and they were moving out to Binondo, to Santa Ana, Ermita, and other places. And then when it was bombed, you can see that people talk about how churches were bulldozed, no? And it's always presented that it was simply an oversight and people were in a hurry. But it has also to me, sometimes it also has to do with just the total shock that Filipinos felt about the effects of the war. You know, every time you read the more recent literature about how that it was not just the Battle of Manila, but the death of Manila, so much of that destruction was centered in Intramuros. So just the shock, the dislocation of seeing Intramuros completely destroyed, that's as well an important narrative. And I will even venture to say that the paring down of the panuelo, the turning away from heritage and history, much of that has to do with the horror of the war, and especially the horror of the last days, and especially it has to do with the horror that was visited upon symbols of our selfhood, such as Intramuros. That's my comment. Those are my comments.
Thank you, sir. I agree with you on both points. Now, that one is that that the story of living, the story of living, and then stories of making it accessible to tourism, are important aspects in making sure that are important aspects and important dimensions of what we should see in Intramuros. And that's one reason why the historic urban landscape approach of UNESCO is critical, because it really drives that home. And I'm sure, like when we've traveled abroad, it's really these areas that are really exciting, really vibrant areas. Now that even if they were destroyed by war, it's reconstructed, and then yet still these places are really the places where to be at, diba? In terms of where are the good restaurants, where is a good bar scene, and then where are all the nice cultural community amenities. This really tends to be in the urban core. And so using the historic urban landscape approach, it really requires that we try to bring all these needs together. But of course, what makes it important, what makes it valuable or significant, is that it comes first from a recognition of what the significance is, right? We would need to recognize that Intramuros is this place and all that, and then only once we have that down, can we properly do development in a manner that's compatible with that. I think one of the challenges that earlier development plans had, while they attempted to do this research, it didn't jive with the fact that there is a law, and that law gives you this mandate, gives you this framework that Intramuros should be done a certain way. And so we tried to work within that we need to find a way that we do balance that to create this place where we can have all these different and exciting things, and these things that bring together communities happening within Intramuros. But of course, it has to be built on that foundation of an understanding of what Intramuros is. And that leads me to the second point, sir. When you mentioned about sadness, I agree with you, and I think that part of that post-war not knowing what to do was because of there's so much grief tied up with Intramuros, right? And so it needed some distance before this momentum to do rebuilding could finally take place. Okay, and that's great, no? And in fact, that would be something that should be properly communicated, no? So like right now, we have a small monument in Intramuros to the dead of World War II, no? When in fact that's a major phase and a major story in the history of the place, no? And that small monument doesn't do justice to the immensity of the human tragedy, no? So I would agree with you that we need to find new ways and new venues to communicate these stories, no? And a particular point also that I and my team felt important, that often gets pushed aside, is that story of inclusion and exclusion. That this was a walled city, and only certain people were allowed in the walls. And then now the parallel is that now that the state is reasserting its control over the area for tourism, for historical reasons, and so now there's also this push to exclude again. So that dynamic, is a very important theme. It's not a happy theme. It's not a theme that we should be proud of, right? But it is a theme that we need to drive home, that it is a reality, and that we Filipinos should be more conscious about how we create a more inclusive community, right? And Intramuros is a microcosm of that. So I agree with you that we should find ways to communicate a fuller richer story of not just the high times and happy times, but also the low times and the sad times. I agree with you, sir. Thank you, sir, for your question. Yeah.
Thank you, Director Manalo, for that comment. Now, Chairman Escalante, would you like to say a few words?
I'm sorry, I'm in another meeting. I'm just monitoring you. Can you just ask somebody to proceed, and then I will just come back once I'm done with another meeting. I'm chairing it kasi again. Yeah. So, I'm sorry. So, I'll just come in once I'm free.
No problem, Chairman Escalante. Now, I'd like to call on Mr. and Mrs. Medalla. Would you like to share some points regarding this discussion?
Right. We are residents of Intramuros. We live here. Professor, it was nice that you brought up, Professor Manalo, that, you said the best places to visit are the places where we live in, people live in.
The best places to live in are the best places to visit.
So yes, I agree with that. That's why we're here. We came
congratulations.
Thank you. We've been here for 5 years. We came here from, from a gated subdivision in Green Hills. We decided to come here.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's really been such a good experience so far. And I think what we would like to comment on or contribute to, to this whole plan, is that since we live here, and we would like to, I think we've been trying to convince some friends to move over actually, is that to make it more livable in terms of, the real things that we need every day, parking, cleanliness and orderliness on the streets. We do not mind seeing our neighbors, around us. We actually find them very interesting. In fact, when they add flavor, as you said, to the diversity, and they add flavor and character to the community. So it's a thing that we do not really mind. But what we would like to see would be in the development plan, for of course, maybe the parking situation be included in it, and also, as you said, because best places to visit. We want people to come to Intramuros for, not only up to a certain. People think that Intramuros closes at a certain time of the evening, and then so nobody's here na mga 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock. We want that to change. We want Intramuros to be a place where people can go to any time because they find it interesting and they know that it is a safe environment.
A friend of mine who visited here, and he's one of he owns a tour outfit in San Sebastian. And when he went here, he told me, you know what, this place has too much potential. The government should be developing this place because if you just put up maybe a few more nice hotels or cafe or whatever, a lot of things for the tourists to do here. A lot of people will go here because not a lot of people can, have the time to go to Vigan or probably Taal because they are practically stay in Manila for a few days. So Intramuros would be the perfect venue. And for me, yeah, but I also feel that the reason why we went here is because this my parents had a property here, and for so many years we just left the property. There was nothing really that was in that property that
here,
in our property. Then one day I decided to. I was thinking of moving to Makati and get a condominium because our kids were already going to school and everything like that. So when I went here, I went up the property and I looked out and I said, "Wow, it's really nice." So that's why we're here. So now we look back and said, I think we made the right decision.
Yes.
So we're happy, and it's very safe, and the people around are nice. That's what my wife said. There's character. In the morning you wake up, you can hear the church bells. You can even hear the sermon from the church, the two churches. So I said that was, I think, before when you used to live in the province, but you're in Manila. So these things are really something else. And of course the IA also has very been helpful to us because they've been coordinating with us and also the other residents. So we know all what's happening, and we're happy to the changes. They have enhanced a lot of the places here. The parks and the place is much brighter and new signs and everything. So we're really excited. We're really excited.
We need to say there's still a lot that can be done, but we're happy with what has been done and what the IA is doing. We appreciate that they give us a voice. We appreciate that they, open and their ears are open to us, and that we feel safe here. That's one thing, and we're happy also.
When we moved here, a lot of our friends told us, "What are you doing there? I mean, you were already in the nice place now. Why did you go there?" When we invite them to come over our place,
They don't want to.
I said, "Now I know why you're here. We also want to be here," because they see, the character. It's really nice. I mean, especially in the evening, it's nice. The breeze from the Manila Bay. I mean, it's really nice. I mean, and the view.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Mr. and Mrs. Medalla. And we appreciate your comments. Thank you so much. Now I'd like to call on the President of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, Ms. Tina Paterno, for her comments on the presentation.
Thanks, Rancho. Thanks, Mark, for this very comprehensive report. I learned so much. You went from introduction on the process to your considerations, and I can see it's a lot of research that went into this, and a great summary of historical significance with all the many layers considered, all the different aspects and layers of history, including the community, not just of the built environment, but also archaeology. And it's big, it's complex, and it's comprehensive. And I also like how you tracked the evolution of the site over time. I think the major missing link for me is a justification on why it should be conserved. Maybe it's a merging of all this data, all the work you've done in making the call. What is the essence of Intramuros that makes it so valuable, so unique, so significant that this aspect of its significance should be transmitted, protected, managed through time, and passed on to future generations? I think until that justification is clear, because what I'm hearing is a very big and broad statement of significance. I think until it's distilled or maybe narrowed down, everything that proceeds from that statement may also be unclear. So like the conservation policies, conservation actions, although I think you already identified, or maybe the IA has identified, which sites are slated for conservation. But other priorities of work, for example, where would you prioritize your budget outside of conservation? What is most significant? I think you've also identified some of that, but conversely, what is also least significant within that complex? You already, sorry, I'm reading my notes. Can we assume, from what you just said of I'm not sure how many sites there were, that those are the most important? Is there a lesser importance and lower down? Because I think these are important also, no?
Right.
If, for example, one is to build on site X, what is nearby? How will it affect these sites? Is one important? Is one lesser important? And that helps you make kind of a judgment call, no, on how to approach it. It'll affect the tourism plan, as you mentioned, no, marketing programs, educational programs, which are all policies that will help you manage change.
Right.
But they have to begin in the statement of significance, and that must be clear. So I'm wondering, like, as it is, how might the guides or the site managers decide how to retain significance? How will they manage its evolution into the future and its development? I'd like to quote James Semple Kerr, and I think there are many students in the crowd. If you Google James Semple Kerr, Kerr, and his conservation plan, that document, it's open source, you can find it. Conservation is about the care and continuing development of a place in such a way that its significance is retained or revealed and its future use is made secure. The objective of the conservation plan is to set out how that aim may best be achieved. I think you have most of the ingredients there. It's just that one difficult task of merging everything together, no, and prioritizing. We have a couple of suggestions. One might be to broaden the comparative analysis to help you there. And you already touched on this, no? You were referencing that Intramuros was a template for other cities. It was the largest government spending at the time for a single site. Did I understand that right? In the world?
The entire complex of fortifications that Spain adopted throughout the whole world now.
Okay. All right, so references like that, I don't think that was there the first time, no? In the first iteration of this plan. And how was Intramuros influenced or not other walled cities in the Philippines, like Argao and Cebu? And broaden it to the former Spanish Empire in America, part of which you've done. Because I'm having a difficult time parsing through its broad history and finding which are the key points that make it so significant. Because parang everything is very significant. That's a sense that I'm getting, no? And so if that's the case, how then do you prioritize and distill it down into the policies to help the future guys prioritize also? I think it would also be useful to touch on authenticity of certain sites within the walls and Intramuros as a whole. I know you cited this as kind of a challenge. I think, though, it might be there already because you had a map and you went through the evolution of Intramuros through its sites. So you have pretty much which are authentic, from what period. I guess it's just a matter of making the call. Is it significant? How does it contribute to the overall significance of Intramuros? And how does that all come together?
Okay.
Sorry, I'm going through my notes. Identify what's of limited, moderate, and high significance. And how do they relate to one another and contribute to this broader thing called Intramuros? And to also cite Ino's point earlier, World War II, that might be a layer to consider because the Japanese occupation of Manila, the Battle of Manila, all had their place in Intramuros. Fort Santiago was used as a detention facility of 600 POWs. So it could be an important site of memory as a battlefield. There's a memorial there to the end of World War II, and it's one of only a handful in the country, I understand. You also touched on the informal settler communities and had focus group discussions. And I'm not seeing this in the folded into the significance, no, as also Ino referenced this. By the 1950s, Intramuros became associated with poverty, the urban poor, decay, informal settlement, urban migration. And so you had informal settlers making a home in what was once the center of political power, religion, and education. You might also want to look at its role as a fortification in the history of fortifications. And lastly, maybe to identify, I know there are scopes and limitations in the preparation of this document, and maybe to identify that up front also might help contextualize the study. So I end there.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Tina, for your feedback. No? And a lot of it is well taken, well considered. No? And as you said, it is really of course, we're working under a lot of terms and conditions and circumstances related to the project. No? So yeah, so the project actually officially ended in March, right? Yeah, okay. And yeah, so this is something, yes, that we did consider, yes, and then I'm glad that you've taken the time to give us this feedback, and I think that it's something that that can be taken up by the next team that will work on the evolution of the plan. But I think also that I think the main point of and of course we would disagree on this one, no? But like the core significance is that and is still ultimately all these relics of the Spanish colonial period, and that if we're looking at it at structures, then these have actually already been identified and in various documents. Malaya Cathedral, San Agustin, Fort Santiago. So those, of course, are the highest priority because, again, as you mentioned, that they are the highest level of authenticity and the highest level of significance in that point. So we really do start. It is where the gravity is, that Spanish colonial period, and all the monuments and all the sites related to that. And so a lot of the other events now, they're more like moons or secondary planets or revolving around that center of gravity. Because ultimately that is really the high point. But I think one of the challenges we do have is that in the since we are looking at it as a landscape, right? And then that there are, of course, a lot of different a landscape and a living community, and a lot of different things are also interplayed. So how we might view things, of course, would differ in our analysis according to our training, our biases, our perspectives. And I'm really glad that you brought up these points now, and I'm sure since it's being recorded by IA, that then future researchers will then go through the archives and then include this in their study. No, but yes, so yes, these are very valid points, very important points, and as you said, that it's there, and then I think it might be like how we read. It might be more of how we see the document and read it in terms, and then what strikes us, what appeals to us now, and so maybe that might be where the different perspectives are now. Yeah. Okay.
Rancho, I don't know. You gave us 3 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes. Am I over time? I had some questions for Mark.
Sure.
No more time. Yes?
You can accommodate that, yeah.
Okay. Mark, you were saying that it's what strikes us in developing the statement of significance.
Right.
I think it probably should be a little less subjective than that. There are many, World War II, for example, I think should also be part of its narrative, and definitely its most known, its sort of claim to fame that everybody knows and loves it for is from the Spanish colonial period. But there are also many other sites that speak from other and significant layers of its history that are not arbitrary, really entirely, and I think could really play a major part in its significance.
Yeah, I agree, Tina. No, and what I mean by that is that of course that is precisely one of the challenges in drafting a statement of significance, right? That you have so much to work with. You have so much to work with, and I think that precisely is the reason why the process is important, right? That different stakeholders and different inputs are able to be brought together, because it's unavoidable that because we of course would look at things from our individual perspectives. Like I would of course, I instinctively looked at the issue of policy frameworks because that's my training as a lawyer, and then also the urban setting as an urban planner. So these things were the ones that resonated with me. But again, that's precisely why the consultative process is important, because it would be great to have all these different inputs from all the different stakeholders into figuring out exactly why something is important. So that's great. So and yes, it was a challenge trying to summarize all the information available to us on into what we felt might be the core.
Absolutely. Consider us a stakeholder
Of
for
course.
your other CMPs. All right, that's it. Thank you, Rancha. Thanks, Mark.
Thank you so much for that. Now, can I call on Architect Lita from the NHCP for his comments?
Hi, Ray. Good afternoon.
Hi, Mark. I listened to your presentation. It was very good, and you captured the layers of history of Intramuros. And now I would be focusing my comments on the livability of the place, as Director Ino Manalos said a while ago. We would like Intramuros to be focused on its urban design. So there is an existing PD 1616 of addressing the conservation, reconstruction, and building of new building structures inside the urban area. So how do we harmonize this to the heritage law right now, and all other international charters on authenticity and also conservation? So Tina said a while ago, why do we conserve? So what do we conserve? And I would like to set an example on the layers of history, like the PLM, for example. Its facade was built in the 1960s style, or an international style with bristles.
Sorry, what is that? The what?
The PLM.
Pamantasan ng Luzon
Yes.
ng Maynila. Okay.
And now, if you go there, it was renovated to look like a neoclassical building. So, how do we, if the statement of significance is very important, like what you wrote in the conclusion of the significance. It's a resilient city that survive all sorts of turbulent past. So how do we quantify that in physical planning, and how do we? I read some of the comments in the audience. How do we address those buildings that were built in the 1970s? It will be 50 years old in the next year. So, do we change it into neoclassical design, like as mandated by PD 1616?
Yeah.
And how do we protect the assets of Intramuros, like the San Agustin Church, which is a World Heritage Site? How do we adjust to the San Agustin in terms of physical change? So those are some of the points that we need to include in the policy as we project what Intramuros will be 10 years from now or more.
Yeah. So number one is that what do you call this? The standard of Intramuros by PD 1616 is the Spanish colonial architecture, right? And that was adopted in 1979, and and law, of course, moves forward, right? Okay. And I do know that in the implementing rules, there was supposed to be this grandfathering process that eventually all buildings would move towards that, right? Okay. But that's in the implementing rules. No? So we have the law, it says Spanish colonial style, no? And then so the thing is, how do we figure out moving there? No? So of course, 50 years ago from today is 1970, right? Okay. And so this is where the Heritage Act enters the picture. That we do have a lot of buildings built from 1945 to 1970, which are coming into their own status as presumed cultural property, right? Presumed important cultural property. And some of these are in fact designed by national artists for architecture. So we now have these two schools of thought, and then we have to find a way to bring them together. But I think like that, we have a number of buildings that were built in that period. And I think maybe one way of looking at it, and of course it now falls onto the IA to craft new implementing rules to implement this, is that now we have basis to respect a lot of the post-war structures, and that they now have to keep that authenticity of being this post-war structure, right? They have to carry that forward now. Yun na yung layering nila, yun na yung message nila, yun yung story nila. So like for them to revert to this neo-colonial or neoclassical appearance, then it would no longer be authentic to what they are. So I think in this way, we try to have a balance, that there is this mandate of PD 1616, and there's also this mandate under RA 10,066. And so trying to reconcile that, of course, it ultimately comes down, it has to be a case-to-case based decision, that each structure will need to have an evaluation and recommendations based on that, as to figuring out where its heritage value lies, whether it is something that lies in the modern era or something that can go back. And actually, a lot of the modern structures are in areas for which there is little research on what those areas look like. I think the schools, however, of course, there's some documentation on how the universities look like at the turn of the century, pero yun na, meron ng bagong layer on top of that. So for them to figure out a new expression that brings the heritage values of each particular site, then that would need to be studied. But ultimately, because we are working with a very complex and multifaceted site, no, it's difficult to draw these broad brushstrokes. Ganito, PD 1616 lang yan, or 10,066 lang yan. No? We'd ultimately have to make an assessment for each and every structure. No? From the archaeology, then to designing the reconstruction or the restoration on top of that. No? It would really be on a site-to-site scale. But at least now, and this is what the CMP does, no, is that it puts into place that these things have to be done, no? That it's not just that an architect entering the picture and saying, oh, let's slap a few columns and a few arches and a few capital windows onto that facade, diba? But rather, there has to be a more deliberate process into figuring out na, first, is there research? Like, are there pictures about what this place looked like? What did it used to be before? No? Is there something that can be found in the documents? No? And then, in the modern era, okay, is this a good example of this particular period's architecture? No? Or is there any significance in this particular site that makes this architecture important? No? So all these different questions. No? So now the CMP should require that these things come together. And so it's not just simply, oh, let's just slap a face of Spanish colonial architecture on top of that.
Yeah. Can I say something? Or hindi allowed? No, I was just gonna say that I had this experience, Attorney Evidente, na I was looking for a friend's house in Merville, and then somebody said, you won't miss it, just go to this street. It's a house. It's a colonial house. No, they told me the colonial style house. And then I said, the only house that I can see here, the only big house I can see here, looks Japanese. Then my friend said, malay mo, Japanese colony yun, di ba? So I mean, the point of my story is to say na, pag sinabi mo namang Spanish colonial, marami namang you can actually rework. I mean, you can work with the language to mean that maraming klaseng style yan. There were Spanish colonies that were existing in the 50s, in the 60s, in the 70s, so that their style was in the 70s, diba? And just as there are other countries with colonies that the period in which they were occupying the colony is associated with Art Deco, with Art Nouveau. So hindi lang yun isang, I mean, diba? Unless I don't think the law specifies the exact detail of what Spanish colonial means.
No, it does actually. No, it refers to a particular period of the 16th to 19th century. So actually, there's still a broad.
Madami pa rin yan. You can include Art Nouveau, di ba? And all. Ang dami niyan. So anyway, di ba? That's just my 2 cents worth.
Thank you so much for that. And then calling on our final reactor from the National Commission for Culture and the Arts, Mr. Molanida.
Hi, hello, attorney. Good afternoon. My first question refers to your experience on revisiting the law, PD 1616, while doing the CMP. Considering the wealth of understanding that we have now about international standards of conservation, as well as the nascent of the National Cultural Heritage Act of 2009, do you think that PD 1616 or portions of it are already obsolete? Or if they are, would you recommend legislative intervention as a measure to cure the obsolescence of this law?
Yes, actually, that's our last policy recommendation. That a serious effort to re-examine PD 1616 should be undertaken. No? Because it affects a lot of the sentiments of, let's say, Mr. Medalla or Director Manalo, that in trying to figure out how to revitalize this area, no, a lot of people feel that some of these things might be And revitalize, I'm not just talking about physical development. I'm really talking about community level development, right? A lot of this that PD 1616 might be putting a damper on, or a wet blanket on all the possible opportunities that could be there. So yes, we do recommend at the end, that, because this is something that we were really struggling with, that and one of the reasons why we felt that a lot of the other development plans could not be implemented is because they did not properly take into consideration that they had to operate under a particular policy framework. And having worked in Congress myself, I worked in the Senate, it's really the process of legislation, it really depende talaga kung meron kang champion in legislation to really push for a bill and the kind of law that you would want. Okay. So while we do make that recommendation that PD 1616 needs to incorporate these principles about conservation that we now know, that have been adopted since 1979. And in fairness to the team that was working in 1979, I think they applied the best available knowledge in coming up with the standards of PD 1616 at that time. But of course, in the 40 years since then, conservation has really evolved so much. So there is a challenge now that even if we do move to amend PD 1616, how do we ensure that the right amendments are introduced? Because I think we can agree that we are lucky that there is a PD 1616, because for all its faults, it gave us an Intramuros, right? It's not a perfect document. It's quite a good document, and it did reflect the best available knowledge that they had in the 70s.
Yeah. In fact, it's a groundbreaking document.
Yeah.
It's a landmark document.
Exactly. And because of that, we now have an Intramuros that has been conserved. Of course, hindi perfect pero at least that idea of what Intramuros is or should be, nandyan. So there's always that risk that the moment you open the floodgates to amendment, people will have different views on what Intramuros should be and how it could be done and all that. So that might be a danger in the process. But yes, we do agree that PD 1616 needs to be amended. But the core of our framework that we proposed is something that can be maintained or implemented whether or not PD 1616 is amended. Okay? Because that was one major struggle that we had to do, because we know that passing a law is difficult. We have no idea how it might take. So we needed to come up with measures, strategies that can work within the current framework. Hence, we had to figure out how do we reconcile PD 1616 with RA 1066. How do we reconcile all these different standards and yet put it and implement it underneath the existing legal framework? So it was a big challenge. It's a big challenge, and so there we are. We have the document.
Yeah. Okay. Related question. I'll just have to take a little piece of your imagination.
Sure.
What do you think? Would you recommend? Ano ba yung gusto mong mangyari sa Intramuros that is not necessarily provided for under PD 1616 right now?
Okay.
In case we want to amend it.
I think the most crucial would be that if we go to a lot of historic centers, they have a lot of different strategies. Some do, you really have to stick to this particular architectural style of a particular period. No? Others are a little bit more flexible, that they focus more on the massing of buildings, the height restrictions, and all that. No, I think there has to be a room to find a balance between these things. No, I know that, for example, like there are these buildings, like especially in the British or American tradition, no, that you have this heritage building, and then they find a way of incorporating an entirely modern structure into it. No, but yet they're able to communicate why that's the strategy they adopted. No? But right now that's not the language, or that's not the framework that PD 1616 provides us. Now, I won't venture to make a specific recommendation and aspect. Yes. No. For me, I think it's more about in maintaining the character of a place. No, so there's some things which are architectural elements. There's some things which are about the heights and spacing and massing of buildings and structures. No, about streetscapes. But ultimately, it's also like how do you revive the culture at the ground level, the social interaction, the dynamic of people. No, this you can imagine that this was a community. Parang more than the architecture, or part of the architecture is that people shouting across the street from their balconies and telling each other what happened today. Diba? That's part of what our culture is. Diba? That in these communities, no, that they would stare at each other and have conversations from their second stories. No? So there are all these different elements that are linked in the built environment. No? And I think trying to figure out, we can leave that for future generations to figure out. So it's really like, how do we capture this character of a place now that brings social and all these different heritage values together in this particular place. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. With regard to the statement of significance, if we are going to overlay a certain timeline on that statement of significance, it appears to me that the Intramuros that you are talking about is the Intramuros as of 1945, an Intramuros that was mostly gone. In the CMP, you have wide acknowledgement, of lengthy acknowledgement of the happenings after World War II. The rebuilding, the coming in of new schools, the establishment of new offices, and the proliferation of informal settlers. But in the statement of significance, parang hindi sila accounted for.
Actually, so I'll take you up on that point, no. And then, so number one, again, we are working under PD 1616.
Okay.
And PD 1616 emphasizes that it is the Spanish colonial period that we're talking about. Okay. And of course, yes, any amount of research that you do, that really is the core historical period that we need to draw reference to. Okay. The reason why in the CMP that we have this extensive discussion is because precisely we want to highlight that things that do not stop with the Spanish colonial period, right?
Okay.
There's history before that, there's history after that, no? But again, we are stuck with PD 1616. So much as I would like to, much as we would want to explore different ways of expressing the different aspects of significance in the story of Intramuros, right? We are stuck with PD 1616 and to that small window that 10,066 gives us.
Okay.
Right?
So in other words, we are registering that as a limitation.
That's no. That's why we did spend a lot of time talking about the legal framework, policy framework. But so that's why our recommendation really is that for all these other phases of Intramuros, no, it might require another museum that that you have. That might be one way of interpreting it, no, that it's still this Spanish colonial architectural structure, that's there. No, you might need to find the right kind of site that captures it, but inside the story is different, right? So again, we're trying to figure out a balance between conveying significance to the built environment, right? Which unfortunately we are stuck with PD 1616, no, or for better or for worse, no. But in driving home that other periods are also important, there are also other ways of expressing the significance, no, and communicating that throughout this entire landscape. No?
And my final question, attorney, is that in the CMP document that were sent to us earlier, it was said there that this particular CMP is hoped to form the foundation of the future new IRR of PD 1616. But at a certain point while crafting this CMP, was your team not tempted to craft this CMP according to the fact that at present Intramuros is actually a tourism product?
Yes. Okay. But of course, tourism is just again one dimension of everything that's intersecting in this place.
Yeah, but IA is a totally tourism agency.
No, actually,
I don't think so.
Yeah, because its mandate it's actually conservation and development.
Okay.
It is a museological arm. It has conservation arm. It has architects, diba?
Okay.
Right.
It has research.
So it's just attached to the DOT. Okay.
Yeah, it's just attached to the DOT. You'll note that the DOT has a number of attached agencies which are cultural that intersect in this area of culture, parks, history, and performances, like Nayong Pilipino and Intramuros, Rizal Park, no. So, and all of these things, no, can have an existence independent of tourism. Tourism is just one layer that comes into this place. So tourism is important, no, but just as well that the interests of, for example, residents, no, both formal and informal, no, offices, no, and all that. Students, for example, no, and I think if we were to compute the economic impact, no, the students are a very big economic driver of Intramuros, diba? Maski malilit yung baon, pero when you add up all these thousands of students, no, when dorming there, photocopying, meals, no, transportation, ang laki ng economic impact niyan.
Yes, sir.
Diba? So and I think one of the challenges was that if we try to emphasize regulations or development in favor of one, diba? We might also be neglecting other aspects in this multi-layered community. It is a very hard project, and we of course had to do it in 8 months, extended to 1 year to work on it. No, and yes, no, there are things that we would have wanted more time to work on, more time to really pick apart some of these concepts and theories and ideas and how we can implement it. But of course, ultimately, it not only has to work on a government timeline or any project timeline, but that is a lot of other development plans are waiting for this. No? So we do the best that we can under the circumstances.
Is the CMP out already? Is it something we can already take a look at?
Yes, sir. So it's available in the IA website.
Okay, thank you.
If you're interested in having a copy, just go to the download section of the IA website, intramurals.gov.ph, to get a copy.
Okay.
But Rancho, that's the updated version. Okay. Ayan. Okay.
I end here, attorney. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And then we're actually running out. We're actually over time. But I can read out a question, a comment here. So this one is from Isabel P. Cornell. So Isabel says, I want to say how much I enjoyed this talk. Absolutely fascinating and informative. Thank you very much. Intramuros has a special place in my heart. My great-grandfather, Pedro P. Cornel Mayol, he first came to the Philippines in 1896 as a soldier of the Spanish-Philippine War. He owned a business in Calle Real between 1904 and 1915. I worked as a consultant archaeologist to IAA in the early 1980s. You are doing a wonderful job. Thank you very much. That's from Isabel P. Cornell. And then we have a question from wait. There's a question. Someone was asking here if from Steffi Gaudier, will there be a fully functioning Filipiniana library dedicated to the studies made on Intramuros, books about the place and other historical buildings inside, etc.? A place where researchers can easily access information. Steffi, the Intramuros administration currently operates the Father Luis Mirino Library. So it is a repository of literature on Intramuros and Manila studies. And IA also operates its own archives, which is open to the public. And then we can accommodate one last question. So this is from Art Cruz. So Attorney Mark, maybe you can answer this. So from Art Cruz, following the Borah Charter guidelines that you used, what is your idea of monitoring and implementation plan? Conservation management plan without those are incomplete and just be a history-laden document without an action plan.
Yeah. Let's see. Trying to remember what I put in the in that aspect. No. But ultimately, yeah, I think if I recall correctly, there are, for example, there's an action plan that had been developed for each of these particular issues, no, and then particular milestones that should be reached, no, and then there are evaluation procedures, no, that that would of course go back to stakeholders and then figure out how these different aspects are being implemented, no. But the main first step really are the next series of plans, no, and a lot more detailed aspects of the feedback and implementation mechanism would ultimately be found there, right? But the core really is regular consultations, regular updating, regular examining of whether all these framework documents really address the issues that we're encountering in Intramuros. No? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Attorney. And now let's end our webinar there. So we still have a lot of questions actually, which is good. And if you really want to ask away, so you just
hello.
Yes, sir.
Hello. Pwede pa ba maghabol?
Dr. Escalante.
Tapos na. Yeah.
It's Dr. Escalante.
No, hi, Dr. Escalante. Would you like to say something?
Yeah, I'm really very sorry because I presided another meeting and katatapos lang namin. Good afternoon, Mark. Attorney Mark, good afternoon.
Hi, good afternoon, sir.
Yeah, I decided to join this meeting because the Director Ino Manalo solicited my help to assist him in his intendencia project. Now, sorry, baka yung tanong ko nasagot na, no? Are you recommending a particular period in the history of Intramuros that we should preserve?
It's not me recommending po. It's really PD 1616 that overrides our individual preferences. No, For modern buildings that are already there, then it can be accommodated under RA 10,066. But ultimately, for sites like Intendencia, we're really working at under PD 1616, and Intendencia is one of the enumerated high priority, high significance sites. No? So it would really need to be, any works there would really need to be carried out under the strictest of requirements of conservation.
Yeah, to be more specific, although I haven't done a very serious study on the Intendencia, in your own assessment, which particular period would you recommend na gamitin as template sa Intendencia? Is it the 1860s design or the post-war reconstruction design?
Well, that's not for me, sir, to say. I think, and this is why we do need to go to each site, especially those of particular significance, would really need to go through a separate conservation study of their own. I think at our level, it is important for us to have highlighted that the Intendencia under PD 1616 is one of the key sites from the Spanish period. So whether the particular restoration process that you would adopt is for the 19th century structure or the American period structure, well, that has to go through the conservation process as outlined by Borah.
So I haven't read the CMP that you drafted. So is there any specific provision or choices, or are you open to possibilities that, yung kasi yung mga pumapasok na yung problema sa akin as later on probably as I help Director Ino. So for instance, if we decide to go back to 1863, I'm not sure if it's 1863 plans, and then if there are no details there, where are we going to get the data in order to fill in the gaps? Because based on my experience, when we go back to early Spanish period, the plans that we have in the archives, they are not that detailed. So they're really cases wherein we have to put up our interpretation of what it used to be. Second, we also are having difficulty getting old pictures wherein that give us an idea as to what is the design.
Of course, the pictures and the designs are it's only part of the process. No? Ultimately, it will need an assessment of like which period Intendencia might have been really more compelling. No? Whether as a physical structure or in terms of its role in history or economics and business.
Let's just maybe I can just simplify things by telling you that we have already commissioned an extensive conservation management plan, and precisely this plan has shown us that there are many aspects of the heritage that is significant in the Intendencia building. It comes from many periods. No.
Yeah.
Now, how we will finally resolve that, or how we will finally make a final plan, that still remains to. I mean, that will still have to be vetted by many authorities. No. Especially because of the existing laws, no?
I think that will ultimately be crucial, no, in terms of getting a consensus on the strategy to move forward. That then the consultations with different architects, different historians, no, and everyone else who's done research on the area, that would have to be taken into consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that is also another concern, no, because we have here conservation management plan commissioned by IA, and then Intendencia will have its own CMP, and
but they can be related. They're related naman to each other.
But there might be some inconsistency.
We'll work on it. We'll work on it when it comes up. No.
Thank you, Chair Escalante, for that comment.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you.
By the way, before we end, so if you have questions, you can email us at culture@intramuros.gov.ph, and please subscribe to our email to our social media for updates on future episodes of the Intramuros Learning Sessions. And if you missed this episode or you came in late, you can rewatch again via our YouTube channel, because this episode is going to be uploaded later in our YouTube channel. And you can also visit us in our Google Arts and Culture page, so you can view our museum collection. So a lot of our artifacts have been digitized already. So feel free to visit us at Google Arts and Culture. And to advertise our talk next week, so this is our 30th Intramuros Learning Session episode on September 19, 2020 at 3 p.m. So we're going to have a tribute on the life of the late Martin Imperial Tino Jr. So we're going to have as guest Matthew Lopez and some colleagues of his from the 80s when he was still working in the Intramuros administration. Now, thank you so much for attending. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you again in our next Intramuros Learning Sessions episode. Thank you.
Hi, Oka.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.